So good morning everybody, I'm Julia from the Department of Geography at Portsmouth University. So it's been a bit of a trek getting up here, but I'm very happy to be here. What I'm going to talk to you this morning is touching on one particular issue to do with water. I'm not touching necessarily on the sort of food aspect, I'm more concerned here talking about basic water supplies. So really what I want to do in my 5-6 minutes is to suggest that we need to explore subsidising water for basic needs if we're really serious about achieving the Millennium Development Goals, which are to halve the number of people who do not have access to basic safe drinking water by 50% by 2015. So they're very ambitious targets and suggesting that we need to sort of re-engage with those again. So as we've sort of heard from the presentations thus far, water is completely essential for life on Earth, human life and for environmental functioning. Water also is a very interesting resource because it has multiple uses and multiple users, and these multiple uses and users can often be in competition but not always. Fresh water supplies are relatively fixed, and that makes it quite challenging because fresh water supplies are also in geographical terms not evenly distributed, and that's also a real challenge as well. And what we've also heard about is that demand for water has been increasing, and this demand on fresh water supplies has been increasing really rapidly over the last 100 years or so. And in the literature, the academic literature and sort of literature in general, there is a lot of evidence talking about a global water crisis. It's very kind of dramatic language that's often used, and arguments that there are water shortages, in part because of increasing consumption of water. Tony's been talking about the aspect of food production and the impact that has on water supplies, but also in terms of pollution levels, reducing the amount of fresh water available. So the sort of human impact on water resources is sort of becoming increasingly apparent. In terms of climate change as well, just to sort of very briefly to touch on that, the impacts of climate change are also going to be felt differentially around the world as well, and often in those regions that are marginal regions now. So those areas that often do not have abundant supplies of water are going to be impacted most greatly. And one of the possible solutions that's been put forward is that we need to treat water as a commodity, that we need to treat water as an economic good. And one of the arguments that's being put forward is that particularly in the agricultural sector, but also in domestic water supplies, water in many parts of the world has been very, very heavily subsidised. And that subsidisation of water encourages inefficient use. And the argument is that if we charge for water, if people have to pay for water, then they're more likely to be efficient and conserve water use. So, for example, if many of you here are students, when you're living back at home, you don't often bother going around the house, for example, turning the lights off or turning the thermometer down because you think, oh, mum and dad will pay the bills. When you move into a house or buy your own house, you will find yourself going around turning the switches off and turning the thermometer down because you're paying for it. So I think there is definitely an issue around when you have to pay for something, you are possibly more efficient in your use of that resource. And what's quite interesting is that this argument of the promotion of treating water as a commodity has been supported by some environmentalists, but also by the sort of the neoliberal market reforms that have really swept across most countries from the sort of late 1980s onwards. And the argument is that we need to leave the supply of goods and services, particularly water, to the markets, that politicians should get out of the business of supplying water, that we should privatise water because the private sector is more efficient at providing water. That's the argument that's often promoted. So what am I arguing? I'm arguing that I accept that treated and piped water costs money, that it is a commodity. I'm not arguing that it isn't. I'm arguing that I think that paying for water does encourage efficiency of use, and that's important. But the issue is what happens when people can't afford to pay for basic water, when people can't afford to pay the connection fees for piped water. So I'm arguing that affordability is an issue, and that this is an issue that's going to impact on whether or not we can achieve the Millennium Development Goals of giving people access to basic drinking water that's safe. So we have this dilemma, and it's a dilemma that I think is really interesting, which is how can we make clean, safe water for basic uses, for basic drinking and cleaning? How can we make that affordable to the poor whilst not encouraging profligate water use, not wasting water. So actually what I'm arguing is that we actually need to re-engage with the idea of subsidies and subsidising water, but pro-poor subsidies. So not just blanket subsidising water, making it free, but targeting that. So what I want to touch on very briefly is some work that I did in South Africa. South Africa is a really interesting country because it's, since the end of apartheid, it has introduced many changes and market reforms. So water is priced, cost recovery takes place, so people have to pay for water use. And what's really interesting as well is that in many parts of South Africa, private water companies are in charge of supplying water. So you have this interesting dilemma, or interesting cases of some areas being serviced by a private water company, often British companies and French companies, and also the state is also supplying water. But what the government found in the late 1990s, early 2000s, was that affordability for basic water was still an issue. People still couldn't afford basic water. So in South Africa, what they implemented was a policy called Free Basic Water in 2000. And what this was the policy that it was a fundamental right for every South African to be given free of charge 25 litres per day of water. Or that roughly equates to 6,000 litres of water per month per household. Assuming a household of 8. And in South Africa, how that's been implemented is not being targeted on sort of the more marginal poor groups in society. They've decided that the most efficient way to implement this subsidy is to give free basic water to all South Africans. And that's being funded from central government funding and also from measures of cross-subsidisation. What was very interesting when I was doing work in South Africa and talking to the policymakers was they told me that the European Union at the time was really very angry with the South African government for implementing free basic water, because they were saying this is a subsidy, it's going to distort the market, this is a problem. But South Africa then argued that this is about basic water, this is just a basic small amount of water. And what was also apparent was I think the EU was unhappy because, again, the state was becoming, and politicians were becoming involved in the delivery of water and making decisions on that front. What I just want to conclude by saying is I think we are now living in very interesting economic times. We are living in we're talking about a global water crisis. We're living through a global economic crisis at the moment, or so we're told. And I think that this is very interesting because it makes us realise that we can't leave everything to the markets, that there is actually a need for politicians to intervene. We're much more receptive currently for politicians to intervene and make decisions and make sort of decisions to, for example, in this country, to give heating allowances or winter fuel bills to elderly people. So I think we are now coming to a time when the issue on the topic of subsidies is possibly not as controversial as it once was. So what I'm simply arguing is that maybe it is time, in terms of water resources at least, to re-engage with the topic of subsidies in a rational and calm way and look at the idea of different types of subsidy approaches across the world and whether they may actually be a suitable approach for meeting the Millennium Development Goals. But again, we're talking about water for basic needs.
Thanks very much.